Hey guys, welcome to Peter Stories. Before we start these amazing stories, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. And tell me, where are you watching from? I want to know. Marcus Sullivan checked his watch for the third time in 10 minutes. 6:47 a.m. The rental truck's heater fought against Montana's October bite, but the cold had already settled into his bones during the 2-hour drive from Billings. Through the windshield, Glacier National Park's peaks caught the early light like broken teeth against a slate sky. He'd made this drive hundreds of times during his 7 years as a ranger here, but never for reasons like this. The ceramic urn beside him contained what remained of his father, a man who'd taught him to read these mountains before he could properly read books. Dad had made him promise, "When my time comes, spread me at Avalanche Creek. That's where I propose to your mother." Mark pulled into the West Glacier entrance, nodding to the seasonal ranger who recognized him despite 3 years away. "Good to see you, Sullivan. Heard about your dad. Sorry for your loss." "Thanks, Jenny. Just a day hike up to Avalanche. Should be back by 4. She frowned. "You hear about the Henderson family?" Henderson. Missing since Monday. Family of 4 from Seattle, parents and 2 teenagers, last seen at the Avalanche Creek trailhead. Jenny's voice carried the particular weight rangers used when discussing the lost. "SAR's been out for 48 hours. Found their car, but..." She shrugged in that way that said everything and nothing. Mark felt something familiar stir in his chest. The same instinct that had made him one of the most effective trackers in the park's history. "Any leads?" Equipment scattered around the parking area. "Looks like they started up Trail of the Cedars, but..." Jenny hesitated. "Mike Torres is heading the search. You know how thorough he is. If he's stumped..." Mike Torres. Mark had trained him personally. If Torres couldn't find them, something was wrong beyond ordinary missing persons protocols. "I'll keep my eyes open," Mark said, though he'd come here to bury his father's memory, not resurrect his ranger instincts. The drive to Avalanche Creek took 25 minutes on the partially closed Going to the Sun road. October meant most facilities were shuttered, maintenance crews scarce, and the handful of remaining tourists clustered around the more accessible trails. Perfect for privacy, terrible for safety. Mark parked in the small lot where asphalt gave way to gravel. 5 cars total, his rental, 1 obvious maintenance vehicle, and 3 others that could belong to day hikers or overnight campers. He shouldered his pack, containing the urn, basic survival gear, and the Garmin GPS he'd carried through hundreds of rescues. The first thing he noticed was wrong happened before he'd taken 10 steps. Boot prints in the muddy trail showed at least 7 different people had passed this way in the last day or 2, but the spacing was off. Mark crouched, running his finger along the clearest impression. Size 11 hiking boot, deep tread, probably a man around 180 pounds. But the stride length suggested someone much shorter, maybe 5'6", to the boot owner's likely 6'2". Ability activated. Exceptional tracking. Mark's mind automatically catalogued details other people missed. The boot's owner had deliberately shortened his steps, probably to appear smaller or match someone else's pace. More interesting, a second set of prints showed someone attempting to step in the first person's footprints, but missing by consistent margins, like a child trying to match a parent's steps, but failing because the adult was intentionally making it impossible. He photographed the prints with his phone, though he wasn't sure why. This was supposed to be a memorial hike, not an investigation. The Trail of the Cedars boardwalk stretched ahead, elevated wooden planks winding through old-growth forest. Mark had walked this loop thousands of times, knew every loose board and questionable handrail. But today felt different. The usual sounds, chipmunks, birds, wind through cedar boughs, were muted, as if the forest were holding its breath. Ability activated, nature reading. 50 yards up the boardwalk, Mark stopped. A Steller's jay, perched motionless on a branch 10 feet away, staring directly at him. Jays were aggressive, territorial, loud. They didn't sit quietly unless something had recently terrified them into silence. Mark followed the bird's previous line of sight and found more boot prints in the soft earth beside the boardwalk. Someone had left the trail here, moving north toward the creek. But the Henderson family's gear had been found at the parking area, suggesting they'd never made it this far. So who belonged to these prints? Mark checked his GPS. 8:23 a.m. He had plenty of daylight for both his personal mission and a quick detour. Dad would understand. He'd been a ranger too, back when the job meant knowing these mountains better than your own backyard. The prints led through dense undergrowth toward Avalanche Creek's rushing water. Mark moved carefully, using techniques he'd developed tracking lost hikers through similar terrain. Step placement, weight distribution, reading the forest's subtle reactions to human passage. What he found made him forget about his father's ashes entirely. A campsite that shouldn't exist. 2 high-end backpacking tents, perfectly arranged around a cold fire pit. Gear organized with military precision, sleeping bags aired out despite the morning's chill, cooking equipment clean and properly stored. But no people and no sounds of recent activity. Mark approached slowly, every instinct screaming caution. The campsite was too perfect, too deliberately arranged, like a museum display titled Normal Family Camping Trip. Ability activated. Investigative intuition. The details were wrong in subtle ways that would escape casual observation. Sleeping bags arranged for 4 people, but only 2 tents. Food hanging in bear bags, but the rope was tied with a trucker's hitch, a knot most families wouldn't know. Clean dishes stacked beside a fire pit that showed signs of multiple uses over several days, not the single night a family might spend. Mark circled the perimeter, looking for what didn't belong. He found it near the creek. A cell phone, apparently dropped in haste. The screen was cracked but functional. When he turned it on, the wallpaper showed a family of 4, 2 adults, teenage boy and girl, smiling against a background of Pike Place Market, the Hendersons. But if this was their campsite, why was their gear reported scattered at the trailhead? And why did the boot prints suggest someone had been deliberately disguising their natural gait? Mark's phone buzzed. Text message from an unknown number. Impressive tracking, Mr. Sullivan. Few people would have noticed the gait discrepancy. He spun around, scanning the forest. Nothing moved except wind-stirred branches and the distant creek. His phone buzzed again. Don't worry, you're perfectly safe. For now. Ability activated. Human presence detection. The feeling hit him like a physical weight, the unmistakable sensation of being observed, not the casual awareness of wildlife or distant hikers, but the focused intensity of someone studying him specifically. The feeling had saved his life twice during his ranger years. Once when a mentally unstable camper had been stalking him through the backcountry. Mark typed back, "Where are the Hendersons?" The response came immediately. The real question is, where are you going, Marcus? Your father's ashes won't spread themselves. Mark's blood chilled. Nobody knew about his father except family, and he'd told the entrance ranger he was hiking to Avalanche Creek, not why. Whoever was texting had been watching him since before he entered the park. You're wondering how I know. The answer is simple. I've been waiting for you. Why? Because you represent something rare, Mr. Sullivan. True expertise. The Henderson family was practice. You're the real test. Mark backed toward the main trail, thumb hovering over his phone's emergency contact. But they were at least an hour from any meaningful help, and whoever was texting seemed to know exactly where he was going. Don't call for backup yet. You haven't seen the best part. There's a new photo arrived. The Henderson family, very much alive, tied to trees in what looked like a cave or rock shelter. They appeared unharmed but terrified. The timestamp showed the photo was taken less than an hour ago. They're safe as long as you're interesting. The moment you bore me, well, October in Glacier can be fatal for unprepared families. Mark stared at the image, his mind racing through possibilities. This wasn't a random kidnapping. It was too elaborate, too personal. Someone had researched him, knew his background, and was using the Henderson family as leverage for some kind of game. What do you want? To test a theory. You spent 7 years developing quite a reputation as a tracker. Sullivan's method, they called it. Instincts that bordered on supernatural. I'm curious whether those instincts function under psychological pressure. The phone buzzed with GPS coordinates, a location approximately 2 miles northeast, well off any maintained trail. You have until dark, roughly 8 hours. Find the Hendersons and everyone goes home safely. Fail and October nights in Montana average 20 degrees. The human body can't survive that exposure. Mark studied the coordinates. The location was in brutal terrain, steep rocky slopes, dense forest, and at least 3 creek crossings. Difficult but manageable for someone with his experience. Too easy, which meant it was definitely a trap. One more thing, Marcus. I'll be tracking you the entire time. Consider it a mutual evaluation. I'm quite curious to see the famous Sullivan method in action. Mark pocketed the phone and shouldered his pack. His father's memorial would have to wait. 4 lives depended on skills he'd spent 3 years trying to forget. But as he left the false campsite and struck out toward the coordinates, one question nagged at him. How did someone learn enough about his tracking methods to reference them by name? Sullivan's method was never officially documented, just a nickname other rangers used for his uncanny ability to find lost people. The answer, he suspected, was about to become clear. The terrain toward the coordinates proved exactly as difficult as Mark expected. Dense lodgepole pine gave way to steep boulder fields, forcing him to pick routes carefully while maintaining speed. October snow from 2 days earlier had melted in direct sunlight but lingered in shadows, making footing treacherous. Mark moved with the efficiency born of thousands of hours in these mountains, but he couldn't shake the feeling that every step was being observed, analyzed, catalogued by someone who understood exactly what he was doing and why. Ability activated, natural orientation. Even without GPS, Mark would have known his precise location within 50 yards. 7 years of emergency response had burned these mountains into his spatial memory. Current position, approximately 1.2 miles northeast of Avalanche Creek, elevation 4,400 feet, bearing 045 degrees toward the coordinates. But something was wrong with his mental map. The terrain ahead didn't match his memory of this area. Where he expected a gentle slope toward McDonald Creek, the GPS showed his route climbing steadily into areas he'd never fully explored. His phone buzzed. Doubt creeping in? Good. Certainty makes people careless. Mark stopped, genuinely unsettled. The text had arrived precisely when he'd begun questioning his route, either incredible timing or someone was reading his body language from a distance. I'm watching you hesitate. Fascinating. In your ranger reports, you never mentioned uncertainty, always decisive, always confident. Yet here you are, second-guessing yourself after 20 minutes. The psychological pressure was deliberate and sophisticated. Whoever was orchestrating this understood that doubt was a tracker's worst enemy. Once you started questioning your instincts, every decision became paralyzed by second-guessing. Mark forced himself to continue toward the coordinates, but began paying attention to different details. His pursuer knew too much about his methods, his psychology, his case history. This wasn't random. It was personal in ways that suggested deep research or direct observation. Ability activated, spatial memory. At the 1-mile mark, Mark reached a rocky outcrop that triggered a specific memory. 3 years ago, he tracked a missing child to this exact spot. 8-year-old Sarah Martinez, lost for 36 hours after wandering from a family picnic. He'd found her sleeping in a natural rock shelter 50 yards south of where he now stood. But when he climbed to the shelter, it wasn't empty. Fresh camping gear, professional-grade equipment that looked expensive and well-maintained, a laptop computer, closed but still warm, and most disturbing, printed copies of his own Ranger incident reports dating back 5 years. Report after report of successful rescues, with his methods highlighted in yellow, notes in the margins analyzing his decision-making patterns, route choices, psychological approaches to panicked families. Someone had studied his career with academic thoroughness. The laptop's screensaver showed aerial photographs of Glacier National Park with GPS tracks overlaid in different colors. Red lines traced the routes of missing persons. Blue lines showed his search patterns during rescue operations. The correlation was perfect. His methods weren't instinctive after all, but followed predictable patterns that could be analyzed and anticipated. His phone buzzed. Understanding dawning? You're not magical, Marcus, just thorough and systematic, which makes you predictable. Mark felt a chill that had nothing to do with October cold. Every successful rescue he'd attributed to instinct had actually followed consistent patterns someone else had mapped in detail. The laptop contains 127 case studies of your search methods. I've spent 18 months developing a complete psychological profile. I know how you think, how you move, how you make decisions under pressure. Who are you? Dr. William Chen, former military psychologist, specializing in interrogation resistance and psychological manipulation. I served 3 tours in Afghanistan before being captured and held for 6 months by people who understood the human mind far better than I did. But what does that have to do with the Hendersons? Everything. My captors taught me that true knowledge comes from breaking down certainty, forcing people to confront their absolute limits. I've been looking for a worthy subject to test these techniques on, someone with genuine expertise, real confidence, someone like you. Mark stared at the laptop screen, seeing his own professional life reduced to colored lines and statistical analysis. The feeling was deeply violating, like discovering someone had been watching through his bedroom window for years. The Hendersons were random selection. A family with enough survival experience to last several hours, but not enough to escape on their own. Their leverage to ensure your cooperation, nothing more. You're insane. I'm thorough. There's a difference. Continue to the coordinates, Marcus. We're approaching the interesting part. Mark closed the laptop and continued northeast. But the psychological damage was done. Every tracking decision now felt transparent, predictable. His supernatural instincts revealed as mundane patterns that any intelligent observer could map and exploit. The coordinates led to McDonald Creek, swollen with October runoff. The rushing water was loud enough to mask approaching footsteps, and the rocky banks provided countless hiding spots, perfect terrain for an ambush. But instead of danger, Mark found another impossible campsite. This one showed clear signs of struggle, scattered gear, torn tent fabric, obvious drag marks leading toward a cliff face. The scene was perfectly arranged to tell a story. Family attacked while sleeping, dragged away by force, probably dead. Except Mark's training recognized the signs of deliberate staging. Real struggle scenes showed different patterns of evidence distribution. This looked like a movie set designed to suggest violence without actually depicting it. His phone buzzed with a new photo. The Henderson family, still alive, still tied to trees. But the timestamp showed it was taken 30 seconds ago, meaning Dr. Chen was close enough to take real-time photos. Ability activated. Human presence detection. Enhanced. The sensation was stronger now. Not just being observed, but being studied with scientific intensity. Mark could almost feel the weight of analytical attention, like standing under a microscope. You're analyzing the staged campsite. Good. Most people would panic at the sight of apparent violence. You're maintaining objectivity under stress. Admirable. Mark spun slowly, scanning the forest. Chen had to be within 100 yards to get cell signal and photograph the hostages simultaneously. But the terrain offered too many hiding spots for systematic searching. Looking for me? Waste of time. I have tactical advantages you can't overcome, but I'm curious, have you noticed the pattern yet? What pattern? Each location contains exactly what you need to find the next clue. The false campsite had the Henderson phone. The rock shelter had my research. This staging ground will have something equally useful. The question is, what are you looking for? Mark studied the stage campsite more carefully, looking beyond the obvious signs of fake struggle. Chen was right. Each location had provided specific information needed to continue. So what was this site supposed to teach him? The answer lay in what was missing rather than what was present. The Henderson family's gear was scattered but not damaged. Expensive equipment that should have been stolen if this were a real robbery. Sleeping bags torn but not beyond repair. Food scattered but not consumed. This wasn't meant to look like an attack, it was meant to look like escape. As if the family had broken free and fled, leaving evidence of their passage for rescuers to follow. The drag marks leading toward the cliff face weren't signs of abduction, but a trail deliberately created for him to follow. Excellent reasoning. Yes, this is your next waypoint. Follow the drag marks to the cliff face. But Marcus, be very careful about what you assume when you get there. The cliff face was a 60-foot limestone wall interrupted by ledges and natural handholds. The drag marks led to a narrow game trail that switchbacked up the rock face, difficult but climbable for someone with mountaineering experience. Mark studied the route, identifying potential hazards. Loose rock, weather exposure, multiple opportunities for ambush from above, but also the most direct path toward higher elevation where hostages might actually be held. His phone buzzed. Time check, 2:47 p.m., sunset at 5:23, temperature dropping to 18 degrees tonight. The Hendersons are wearing cotton clothing suitable for day hiking, not overnight exposure. The message was clear. Psychological pressure through time limits. Chen was creating urgency to force hasty decisions that might lead to mistakes. But Mark had spent years conducting technical rescues under similar pressure. He began climbing methodically, testing each handhold, moving with the efficiency that comes from life or death experience. Halfway up the cliff face, he found something that changed everything. A piece of equipment he recognized immediately. His own multi-tool, lost during a rescue operation 2 years ago. Cleaned, maintained, and placed precisely where he'd have to see it during the climb. Dr. Chen hadn't just studied his methods from reports and observations. He'd been present during actual rescue operations, close enough to retrieve dropped equipment, invisible enough to avoid detection. For 2 years, Chen had been shadow-stalking him through the mountains. The psychological impact was profound and immediate. Every rescue Mark had conducted might have been observed by someone analyzing his methods, mapping his patterns, preparing for this exact confrontation. His phone buzzed. The multi-tool was left on Eagle Peak July 15, 2021. You were rescuing the Morrison family after their 72-hour ordeal in a lightning storm. I watched from a distance while you improvised a rope system to evacuate them from a precarious ledge. Impressive work, by the way. Mark's hands shook as he gripped the rock face. Chen had been there, watching, while Mark had risked his life to save strangers. The violation felt deeper than physical assault. I've observed 17 of your rescue operations over the past 3 years. You develop emotional connections with the people you save. You take their safety personally, beyond professional obligation. It's your greatest strength and your most exploitable weakness. You sick bastard. I'm thorough. The Morrison family trusted you completely because you projected absolute confidence. But confidence built on false assumptions crumbles quickly. How confident do you feel now, Marcus? Mark forced himself to continue climbing, but Chen's psychological warfare was working. Every handhold felt uncertain, every decision questionable. The famous Sullivan method reduced to predictable responses that could be manipulated by someone who understood the underlying patterns. At the top of the cliff, Mark found the Henderson family. They were exactly where Chen's photo had suggested, tied to trees in a natural rock shelter, unharmed but terrified. The teenage boy saw him first and began struggling against his restraints, making muffled sounds through duct tape over his mouth. Mark approached carefully, scanning for traps or surveillance equipment. The family appeared to be genuine hostages, not actors or willing participants. Their terror was real, their restraints secure, but not cruelly tight. As he reached for his knife to cut their bonds, his phone buzzed one final time. "Stop. Turn around slowly. We need to talk." Mark turned and found himself facing a man in his early 40s, Asian American, wearing expensive hiking gear and carrying himself with military bearing. Dr. William Chen looked exactly like someone who could disappear into mountain terrain while conducting psychological experiments on unwilling subjects. Dr. Chen, I assume. Marcus, finally. I've been looking forward to this conversation for 3 years. Chen's voice was cultured, professional, with the slight formality of someone for whom English was a second language. Please step away from the hostages. We have business to conclude. Let them go. Your problem is with me. My problem isn't with you, Marcus. It's a question about you, specifically. What happens when someone with your abilities confronts someone who understands those abilities better than you do yourself? Chen moved with the controlled grace of someone trained in close-quarters combat. He stayed just outside Mark's reach, while maintaining clear sightlines to both the hostages and multiple escape routes. I spent 6 months in a Taliban prison camp, subjected to interrogation techniques that broke down everything I thought I knew about psychological resistance. My captors taught me that expertise becomes weakness when it's based on predictable patterns. So you decided to torture innocent families? I decided to test a hypothesis. Can systematic analysis overcome intuitive expertise? Can predictable patterns be exploited to defeat genuine skill? Chen's eyes showed the particular intensity of someone whose worldview had been fundamentally altered by trauma. You represent the perfect test case. Mark studied Chen's positioning, looking for tactical advantages. The man was clearly trained in unarmed combat and had chosen the confrontation site carefully. But he was also talking, rather than acting, which suggested psychological complexity beyond simple sadism. The Taliban broke me by analyzing my responses to stress, identifying my behavioral patterns, then exploiting those patterns to create cognitive dissonance. I want to understand whether the same techniques work on someone with your particular combination of expertise and confidence. Understanding doesn't require torturing families, doesn't it? How much do you really understand about your own abilities now that you know they're predictable? How confident do you feel in your supernatural instincts now that you've seen them mapped and analyzed? Chen smiled without warmth. The doubt is already working, isn't it? Mark felt the truth of that statement like a physical blow. Every decision since finding Chen's research had been contaminated by second-guessing, uncertainty, the knowledge that his methods were transparent to someone who'd studied them systematically. But here's what my research couldn't predict, Marcus. how you'd respond when the stakes became personal, when the people you're trying to save look directly at you, depending entirely on your expertise to survive. Chen gestured toward the Henderson family, still bound and watching their conversation with terrified hope. So, here's my final test. I'm going to leave. You can either follow me and attempt capture, or you can free the hostages, but not both. The restraints are timed locks that will release automatically in 6 hours. By then, the temperature will have dropped to fatal levels for people wearing cotton clothing. That's not a choice. Of course it is. Save the family now, and I disappear forever to continue my research on other subjects, or pursue me immediately while your tracking skills are still fresh and have a chance to end this permanently. Mark stared at Chen, recognizing the sophistication of the psychological trap. Either choice validated Chen's hypothesis about predictable behavioral patterns. Saving the hostages immediately proved that emotional connection overrode tactical thinking. Pursuing Chen proved that confidence in his abilities overrode immediate humanitarian concerns. There's a third option, Mark said. Really, I've modeled 17 different scenarios. None include... Mark cut the Henderson family's restraints with 3 quick slashes of his knife, then tackled Chen before the man could react. Ability activated, all skills simultaneously. Chen had made one crucial error in his analysis. He'd studied Mark's rescue methods but never seen him in direct physical confrontation. 7 years of technical mountain rescues had built not just tracking skills, but combat-level reflexes, physical conditioning, and the ability to make split-second decisions under lethal pressure. The fight was brief and decisive. Chen's military training was evident, but rusty. Mark's mountaineering strength and desperate motivation overcame technique and tactical positioning. Within 90 seconds, Chen was zip-tied with restraints from Mark's rescue kit, bleeding from a broken nose, but otherwise unharmed. Impossible, Chen gasped. The scenarios didn't account for improvisation, Mark finished. You analyzed my patterns, but not my ability to break them when necessary. As they waited for search and rescue teams to arrive, Chen stared at Mark with genuine scientific curiosity, despite his capture. How? He asked finally. You made it personal, Mark replied. That family didn't choose to be part of your experiment. When someone threatens innocent people to test a theory, the theory stops mattering. But the patterns, the predictability, still there. But patterns aren't prison cells. Understanding how you usually think gives you the freedom to think differently when it matters. Chen nodded slowly, as if filing away this final data point for future analysis. Fascinating. I may have learned more from failure than success. Mark looked at the Henderson family, reunited and warming themselves with emergency blankets from his pack. In the fading October light, with Chen's secure and rescue teams en route, he felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years, the satisfaction of using his abilities to protect people who needed protection. Later, after the arrests and medical evaluations and hours of statement-giving, Mark returned to Avalanche Creek. His father's ashes had waited patiently through the day's crisis, and the memorial service felt more meaningful for being delayed. As he scattered the ashes in the rushing water, Mark thought about patterns and predictability, expertise and improvisation. His father had taught him to read these mountains, but Chen had taught him something equally valuable. That true expertise isn't about following patterns, but knowing when to break them. The famous Sullivan method would continue to evolve, because the best methods always do. Some patterns are meant to be transcended. Epilogue. Dr. William Chen received psychological treatment while serving his federal sentence for kidnapping and assault. His research on predictable behavioral patterns was classified and never published, though certain military applications were reportedly developed based on his findings. The Henderson family recovered fully from their ordeal and established a foundation supporting search and rescue operations in national parks. Marcus Sullivan returned to Ranger Service 6 months later, developing new training protocols that emphasized adaptive thinking over rigid methodology. He never spoke publicly about the events at Glacier National Park, but his revised approach to wilderness rescue became widely adopted throughout the National Park Service. The case files listed the incident as a successful rescue with one perpetrator apprehended. What they didn't document was the day a theoretical framework met practical experience and discovered which one proved stronger when lives hung in the balance. Some expertise can't be reduced to patterns. Some patterns exist to be broken when it matters most. And sometimes the most important ability is knowing the difference. Jake Morrison checked his pack one final time in the pre-dawn darkness of his cabin. 7 years as a forest ranger had taught him that preparation saved lives, and old habits died hard, even though he'd been working private search and rescue for the past 2 years. The missing person report had come in 3 days ago. Dr. Sarah Chen, a botanist from the University of Washington, had failed to return from what should have been a routine plant survey in the Olympic National Forest. The coffee maker gurgled to life as Jake laid out his gear on the kitchen table. GPS unit, backup compass, first aid kit, emergency radio, high-lumen flashlight, backup batteries, water purification tablets, emergency shelter, rope, knife. Everything in its designated pocket, every piece of equipment tested and trusted. He'd learned the hard way that the forest didn't forgive oversight. His phone buzzed with a text from Deputy Marshal Lisa Santos. Chen's car still at Elwha Trailhead. No new tracks. Rangers did standard grid search yesterday, came up empty. Her research permit shows Sector 7G through 9G. Good luck. Jake pulled on his worn leather boots and shouldered the pack. The October air bit at his face as he stepped outside, his breath forming small clouds in the 4:30 a.m. darkness. The drive to the trailhead would take 90 minutes, putting him at the start of Chen's planned route, just as the sun cleared the ridgeline. The Olympic forest in late autumn was a maze of Douglas fir, western hemlock, and red cedar, their massive trunks disappearing into a canopy so thick that full daylight never reached the forest floor. Jake had worked these woods for years, knew every major trail and most of the game paths. If Dr. Chen was still out there, he'd find her. He parked next to the lone Toyota Camry at the Elwha Trailhead. Through the driver's side window, he could see Chen's research notebook open on the passenger seat, a travel mug still sitting in the cup holder. Jake walked a slow circle around the vehicle, noting the layer of dew on the windshield. The parking receipt dated 3 days ago, the small pile of cigarette butts near the driver's door. But those looked older, probably from other visitors. The trail began 20 yards from the parking area, marked by a weathered wooden sign, Elwha River Trail, 14 miles to Sol Duke Hot Springs. Jake knew Chen's permit showed research sites well before the hot springs, in the dense forest sections, where rare orchid species had been documented. 15 minutes up the trail, Jake stopped. Something was wrong. The forest was too quiet. In 7 years of ranging, he'd developed an ear for the subtle orchestra of woodland sounds. The rustle of small mammals, the distant call of birds, the creak of settling trees. This morning, the silence felt deliberate, unnatural. Even the ever-present drip of moisture from the canopy seemed muted. Jake activated his first ability without conscious thought, his eyes beginning to track patterns invisible to most people. 20 feet ahead, a single footprint marked the soft earth beside the trail. Woman's hiking boot, size 7 or 8, with a distinctive diamond-patterned tread. The depth and clarity indicated the print was recent, probably Chen's. But as Jake knelt to examine it more closely, something else caught his attention. Another print, barely visible, overlapped Chen's by just a few millimeters. Larger, men's size 11, with a completely different tread pattern. Someone had followed her, stepping almost exactly in her tracks to avoid detection. Jake stood slowly, his ranger instincts fully engaged now. Chen wasn't just lost. Someone had been tracking her. He continued up the trail, his eyes scanning not just for obvious signs, but for the subtle disturbances that told the real story. A broken twig at exactly shoulder height, a small scrape on a tree trunk where something had brushed against it. Chen's trail was clear enough. She'd stayed on the main path for the first mile, then veered off toward her research sites. But the shadow trail was there too. The second person had followed her off the main trail, still maintaining the careful pattern of stepping in or near her tracks. Whoever this was knew woodcraft, understood how to move without leaving obvious sign. Jake's second ability kicked in as he noticed the behavior of the local wildlife. A squirrel chattered aggressively from a tree 30 yards ahead. Its tail bristled with agitation. 2 ravens circled overhead, their harsh calls cutting through the silence. The animals were disturbed, exhibiting the kind of stress behavior Jake had learned to read during his ranger years. Something bad had happened in these woods. The trail led deeper into the forest, winding between massive cedar trunks and through clearings carpeted with ferns. Jake moved slowly, reading the story written in pressed earth and disturbed vegetation. Chen had stopped frequently, probably to examine plant specimens. Her tracks showed the characteristic pattern of someone engaged in methodical research. Short steps, frequent direction changes, pauses beside fallen logs and in areas with diverse undergrowth. But the shadow tracks told a different story. They showed patience, calculation. The second person had waited while Chen conducted her research, maintaining distance but never losing contact. This wasn't a chance encounter with another hiker. This was surveillance. 2 hours into the search, Jake found Chen's first research site. A small clearing beside a seasonal creek with several rare orchid species growing in the filtered sunlight. Chen's field notebook lay open beside a fallen log, its pages spotted with moisture but still readable. Her handwriting was neat, methodical, detailed observations about soil conditions, light levels, specimen locations. The notebook's final entry was dated 3 days ago, 2:47 p.m. Found excellent specimens of Spiranthes romanzoffiana in creek bed. Photographing root structure. Will camp here tonight to observe nocturnal pollinators. Jake examined the area around the notebook. Chen's tracks showed she'd spent considerable time here, moving back and forth between different plant clusters. She'd set up a small camp. Jake could see the depression where her sleeping bag had been placed, the ring of stones where she'd built a small fire. But she'd left in a hurry. Her camp was scattered, gear abandoned. Jake found her water bottle wedged between 2 rocks near the creek. Her camera bag hung in a tree as if she'd hidden it quickly. And for the first time, the shadow tracks became clear, obvious. Size 11 boots, military-style tread, moving in a pattern that spoke of training and discipline. The unknown person had approached Chen's camp from downhill, using the sound of the creek to mask his movement. Jake's third ability activated, the investigative intuition that had made him one of the best trackers in the Olympic forest system. The pattern was wrong. If Chen had simply gotten lost or injured, her gear would be with her. If she'd encountered wildlife, there would be different signs, scratch marks, disturbed vegetation, scent markers. This looked like an abduction, but executed by someone with significant outdoor skills. The shadow trail continued upstream, following the creek bed where the ground was too rocky to leave clear prints. But Jake's years of experience let him read the story in other ways. A wet boot print on a boulder. A thread of blue fabric, the same color as Chen's jacket according to the missing person report, caught on a branch 8 feet above the water. Someone had carried her. Jake followed the creek for another hour, noting the careful route selection. Whoever had taken Chen knew these woods, understood how to move through difficult terrain while carrying a burden. The path avoided areas where tracks would be obvious, stuck to rocky ground and creek beds, chose routes that would challenge even an experienced tracker. But Jake had advantages beyond normal tracking skills. His fourth ability, natural orientation, let him navigate by instinct even when GPS signals were blocked by the heavy canopy. He could sense that the route was leading toward an area he'd patrolled years ago, a remote section of the forest where illegal hunting camps were sometimes found. The thought triggered his fifth ability. Jake stopped walking and stood perfectly still, letting his senses expand outward. The sensation came immediately. He was being watched. Not the casual observation of wildlife, but the focused attention of human eyes. Someone was out there, observing his progress. Jake pretended to examine a tree trunk while scanning the forest around him. Nothing obvious, but the feeling persisted. Whoever had taken Chen was still in the area, and they were tracking him now. He continued following the creek, but altered his pattern, moving more cautiously and using his knowledge of the terrain to avoid obvious ambush points. The trail led steadily upward, toward a ridgeline Jake remembered from his ranger days. There was an old logging camp up there, abandoned for decades, but with structures that could still provide shelter. 3 hours after finding Chen's research site, Jake reached the edge of a large clearing. The remains of the logging camp were exactly as he remembered. A partially collapsed main building, several smaller structures, rusted equipment scattered among the trees. But someone had been maintaining the site. The main building showed signs of recent repair, and there was a thin line of smoke rising from a concealed chimney. Jake's sixth ability activated as he studied the camp. Spatial memory flooded back in perfect detail. He'd been here 7 years ago, investigating reports of illegal activity. The layout was exactly the same, but with careful improvements. Someone had been using this place for a long time, turning it into a base of operations. Movement in the main building's doorway caught his attention. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall, lean, wearing military surplus clothing. The man moved with the controlled confidence of someone comfortable in his environment. "Jake Morrison," the man called out, his voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "I was wondering when you'd arrive." Jake stepped into the clearing, his hand resting casually near the knife on his belt. The man knew his name, had been expecting him. This was no chance encounter. "Dr. Marcus Vale," the man continued, walking slowly toward the center of the clearing. "Former military psychologist, current researcher into human behavior under extreme conditions. I've been following your work for some time, Mr. Morrison. Your reputation as a tracker is quite impressive." Jake studied the man approaching him. Vale appeared to be in his 40s, with graying hair and intelligent eyes. His movements were precise, economical, suggesting military training. But it was his calm demeanor that was most unsettling. He showed no signs of stress or concern about being discovered. "Where's Dr. Chen?" Jake asked, keeping his voice level. Vale smiled, an expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Safe, for now. She's been an excellent subject for my research. Dr. Chen has demonstrated remarkable psychological resilience under stress, much like I expect you will." What kind of research?" "Human behavior in survival situations," Vale said, continuing his slow approach. "Specifically, how training and instinct compete when people are placed under extreme psychological pressure. You see, Mr. Morrison, during my military service, I made recommendations about soldier psychology that led to unfortunate outcomes. Men died because I misjudged their capacity to handle stress." Vale stopped about 20 feet away, his hands visible but relaxed. "That failure taught me the limitations of theoretical psychology. Real understanding requires empirical testing. Field research. Dr. Chen has been helping me explore the boundaries of human adaptability." Jake's mind raced through the implications. Vale wasn't just a predator. He was a researcher with a twisted methodology. Chen was alive, probably being held somewhere in the camp, but this confrontation had been planned from the beginning. "You've been watching me since I arrived," Jake said. "From the parking lot, actually. I've had surveillance equipment monitoring the trailhead for weeks. When I saw your vehicle, I knew we were about to begin a much more interesting phase of the research." Vale reached into his jacket pocket, moving slowly to avoid alarming Jake. He withdrew a small electronic device. "GPS tracker," he explained. "I've been monitoring your progress all morning. Your tracking abilities are genuinely impressive. You followed a trail I thought I'd concealed quite well." Dr. Chen's trail wasn't meant to be concealed, Jake realized. "You wanted me to follow it." "Exactly. The real test begins now. You see, Mr. Morrison, I've studied your background extensively. 7 years as a forest ranger, numerous successful search and rescue operations, a reputation for finding people others give up for dead. I'm curious to see how those skills perform under pressure." Vale pressed a button on the device. Immediately, Jake heard the sound of mechanical movement from several locations around the clearing. Hidden cameras were emerging from concealment, adjusting their positions to track his movements. "This entire area is monitored," Vale continued. "Motion sensors, infrared cameras, audio pickups. I've been preparing for this encounter for months, Mr. Morrison. Every possible variable has been calculated." Jake felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with genuine danger, but his years of experience kept him calm. Vale was intelligent, prepared, and clearly unstable. But he was also making a classic mistake. He was talking too much, revealing too much about his setup. "You want to tell me why?" Jake said, encouraging Vale to continue explaining. "Human psychology fascinates me," Vale said, his eyes brightening with genuine enthusiasm. "In the military, I watched good men break under pressure, saw others exceed every expectation, but the theoretical models were inadequate. Too many variables, too much reliance on controlled laboratory studies." Vale began walking a slow circle around Jake, maintaining his distance but clearly comfortable with the tactical situation. "Real understanding requires real stakes, Doctor. Chen has been an excellent initial subject, a highly educated, rational individual placed in a survival scenario with gradually increasing stress levels, but you represent something much more interesting." "Which is?" "A predator," Vale said simply. "Oh, a benevolent one, certainly, but your psychological profile shows all the classic markers. Enhanced situational awareness, superior pattern recognition, comfortable with isolation and danger. You're a natural hunter, Mr. Morrison just pointed in a pro-social direction." Jake realized that Vale's psychological assessment was uncomfortably accurate. His tracking abilities, his comfort in dangerous situations, his capacity to remain calm under pressure, they were predator traits, refined by training and experience, but fundamentally instinctual. "I'm curious to see what happens when a hunter becomes the hunted," Vale continued. "When someone with your skills is placed in a genuinely threatening situation with real consequences." "The consequences being Dr. Chen's life?" "Among other things. You see, I've designed what you might call a practical examination. Dr. Chen is being held in a secure location with limited life support. Oxygen, water, basic warmth, but finite resources. She has perhaps 6 hours remaining under current conditions." Vale stopped walking and faced Jake directly. "You have a choice. You can attempt to locate and rescue Dr. Chen using your considerable tracking skills. But the area I've selected is quite challenging, and I'll be actively working to prevent your success. Or you can engage me directly, end the threat at its source, as it were. But that approach carries its own risks. I'm quite well prepared for confrontation, and Dr. Chen's location will die with me if you choose violence." Jake weighed his options. Vale was clearly intelligent and had been planning this scenario for months. The camp would be trapped, monitored, designed to channel Jake's movements into predetermined patterns. But Chen was running out of time, and Vale's psychological need to observe and document might create exploitable weaknesses. "You're assuming I'll play your game," Jake said. Vale smiled again, the expression somehow more unsettling than any threat. "Oh, I think you will. You see, I've studied your psychological profile quite extensively. You have a compulsive need to protect others, particularly those you perceive as innocent victims. It's what made you an excellent ranger and what drives your current work. You're describing basic human decency. I'm describing an exploitable psychological vulnerability. Dr. Chen is counting on your compulsive heroism, Mr. Morrison. The question is whether your considerable skills can overcome my considerable preparation." Vale gestured toward the forest beyond the clearing. "She's out there, somewhere within a 2-mile radius. I've left a trail, naturally. I want you to have a sporting chance, but I've also prepared several complications, diversions, false leads, time-consuming obstacles." Jake studied Vale's face, looking for tells, for any sign of deception or uncertainty. But the man appeared genuinely confident, even excited about the scenario he'd constructed. "What makes you think I won't just call for backup?" Vale held up a small signal jammer. "No communications in or out. I've been blocking radio and cellular signals for a 5-mile radius since yesterday. As far as the outside world knows, you're simply conducting a routine search." The psychological chess match was becoming clear. Vale had constructed an elaborate scenario designed to test Jake's abilities under pressure while satisfying his own research objectives. But his need to explain, to have his work understood and appreciated, might be providing crucial information. "You made one mistake," Jake said. "Oh? I'd be very interested to hear your analysis." "You're treating this like a laboratory experiment. Controlled variables, measurable outcomes, predictable results. But you're dealing with human beings, not lab rats." Vale's expression shifted slightly, showing genuine curiosity. "Elaborate. You've studied my background, but you don't understand it. 7 years in these woods taught me that the forest doesn't follow rules. Plans fail, equipment breaks, weather changes. Survival isn't about perfect preparation. It's about adaptation." An interesting perspective. I look forward to seeing how that philosophy performs under controlled conditions. Jake looked around the clearing one final time, noting camera positions, potential escape routes, areas of concealment. Vale had clearly spent considerable time and resources preparing this scenario, but his very thoroughness might be a weakness. Over-engineered plans were brittle, vulnerable to unexpected variables. "Dr. Chen," Jake said, "prove she's alive." Vale reached into another pocket and withdrew a small radio. He keyed the transmitter twice, waited, then received 2 clicks in response. "She's conscious and cooperative," Vale said, "for now. But as I mentioned, time is a factor." Jake made his decision. He would play Vale's game, but on his own terms. The psychologist wanted to study predator behavior under pressure, but he'd underestimated what that actually meant. A true predator didn't follow expected patterns. "What's my time limit?" Jake asked. "Sunset," Vale replied. "Approximately 6 hours. After that, Dr. Chen's situation becomes unsustainable." Jake nodded and began walking toward the tree line. But instead of following the obvious trail markers Vale had prepared, he angled toward a section of forest he remembered from his ranger days. If Vale wanted to study adaptive behavior, he was about to get a real education. "Mr. Morrison," Vale called after him, "you're going the wrong direction." Jake didn't reply. He'd spotted something Vale had missed, a subtle game trail that would let him approach Chen's probable location from an unexpected angle. The psychologist's careful preparation was about to encounter the chaos factor of genuine field experience. As Jake disappeared into the forest, he heard Vale speaking into his radio, coordinating with whatever associates he had positioned around the area. But Jake was no longer playing by Vale's rules. The hunt had begun, but not the way the psychologist had planned. Jake moved through the forest with the fluid efficiency of someone completely at home in the environment. Vale's surveillance network was sophisticated, but it was designed to monitor obvious approach routes. The game trail Jake followed was nearly invisible, used by deer and elk rather than humans, winding through areas where electronic sensors would be difficult to conceal. His tracking skills revealed the true scope of Vale's operation. Hidden cameras were mounted at regular intervals along the main trail, motion sensors positioned to detect movement through obvious corridors. But the coverage had gaps, blind spots that someone with Jake's experience could exploit. More importantly, Jake's spatial memory was providing crucial advantages. He remembered this area from his ranger days, knew about the old mine shafts, the seasonal streams, the areas where winter storm damage had created natural obstacles. Vale might have studied maps and satellite imagery, but Jake had walked every square mile of this terrain. 20 minutes into his approach, Jake found the first of Vale's complications. A deadfall had been rigged across the game trail, designed to delay or injure anyone following the route, but the trap was too obvious, too carefully constructed. Vale was thinking like a laboratory researcher, not a woodsman. Jake bypassed the deadfall and continued toward his objective. His instincts told him that Chen was being held somewhere with natural advantages, probably one of the old mine complexes that dotted this part of the Olympic forest. Vale would want a location that was defensible, controllable, but also dramatic enough to satisfy his psychological needs. The Copper Creek mine complex was 2 miles north of the logging camp, accessed by a series of switchback trails that would be easy to monitor and defend. Jake had investigated the area several times during his ranger career, knew about the partially collapsed tunnels, the old equipment building that still had a solid roof. But instead of approaching directly, Jake used his knowledge of the local hydrology. Copper Creek ran underground for several hundred yards before emerging near the mine complex. An experienced caver could follow the underground watercourse and emerge inside the perimeter Vale had undoubtedly established. Jake found the creek's underground entrance behind a screen of fallen trees, exactly where he remembered it. The passage was tight, uncomfortable, but navigable for someone with cave experience. More importantly, it would be completely invisible to Vale's surveillance network. The underground route took 40 minutes to traverse, crawling through darkness with only his flashlight to mark the way. But Jake emerged exactly where he'd planned, inside a drainage culvert 50 yards from the mine's main building. Through the culvert's opening, Jake could see Vale's setup. 3 associates positioned around the complex, armed with tactical equipment and radio communications. Dr. Chen was visible through a window in the main building, tied to a chair, but apparently unharmed. Vale himself was nowhere to be seen, probably monitoring the situation from the logging camp. Jake studied the tactical situation. Vale's people were professionals, positioned to cover all obvious approach routes, but they were thinking like security personnel, not hunters. They were watching for threats coming toward them, not for someone who might already be inside their perimeter. Jake's equipment included 50 feet of climbing rope and a tactical knife. More importantly, he had complete knowledge of the mine complex's layout. The main building was connected to the old processing facility by a covered walkway, and the processing facility had a basement level that connected to the mine tunnels themselves. Jake worked his way through the drainage system to the processing facility, entered through a partially collapsed foundation wall, and made his way to the basement level. From there, he could access the tunnel system that connected to the main building. The tunnels were partially flooded and unstable, But Jake's ranger training included cave rescue techniques. He moved carefully but quickly, knowing that Chen's time was running out. He emerged in the main building's basement, directly below where Chen was being held. The building's old wooden construction transmitted sound clearly. Jake could hear her breathing, the creak of her chair when she shifted position. But he could also hear one of Vale's associates moving around on the main floor, conducting periodic security checks. Jake waited until the footsteps moved away from Chen's location, then climbed the basement stairs. The main floor was a single large room, with Chen tied to a chair near the window where she'd be visible to outside observers. Jake approached from her blind spot, moving silently across the old wooden floor. When he reached her chair, he covered her mouth gently with his hand and whispered directly into her ear, "Dr. Chen, I'm Jake Morrison, search and rescue. I'm going to cut your restraints, but we need to be completely silent." Chen nodded, her eyes wide with relief and fear. Jake used his knife to cut the zip ties holding her to the chair, but left them loosely in place so her position would appear unchanged from outside. "Can you walk?" Jake whispered. "Yes," Chen breathed back. "But there are 3 of them and they have radios." Jake nodded. He'd observed the same thing during his approach. Vale's associates were in constant communication, conducting regular check-ins. Any disruption in their routine would trigger an immediate response. But Jake had one final advantage. His 6th ability, spatial memory, was providing him with perfect recall of the mine complex's original layout. There was an emergency exit from the main building, a tunnel that led to a ventilation shaft on the ridgeline above the complex. The tunnel entrance was hidden behind a false wall in the building's northeast corner. Jake had discovered it during a safety inspection years earlier, but had never documented its existence in his official reports. Jake led Chen to the false wall and showed her how to access the hidden tunnel. "This leads to a ventilation shaft about 200 yards uphill," he whispered. "Follow it to the surface, then head due south until you reach the main trail." "What about you?" "I'm going to make sure Vale's people don't follow us." Chen disappeared into the tunnel, and Jake began preparing his exit strategy. Vale's psychological experiment was about to encounter a variable the researcher hadn't anticipated, a predator who understood that the best way to end a hunt was to eliminate the threat completely. Jake made his way back to the basement, but instead of leaving through the tunnel system, he positioned himself where he could observe the main floor through the stairwell. When Vale's associate made his next security check, Jake would be ready. The footsteps approached Chen's position. Jake heard the associate's voice, speaking into his radio. "Subject secure, no change in status." But then Jake heard a different sound. The associate was examining Chen's restraints more closely. "Control, we have a problem," the voice said, much louder now. "Subject's restraints have been cut. Repeat, we have a breach." Jake abandoned stealth and moved quickly up the stairs. Vale's associate was reaching for his weapon when Jake tackled him, using his superior knowledge of the building's layout to drive the man into a support beam. The associate went down hard, his radio skittering across the floor. Jake grabbed the radio and heard Vale's voice. "All units converge on the main building. Subject is escaping with assistance." Jake smashed the radio and made his way to the window. Vale's other 2 associates were moving toward the building from their perimeter positions, but Chen would have had enough time to reach the surface through the ventilation shaft. Jake had accomplished his primary objective. Chen was free and moving toward safety. But Vale was still out there, still dangerous, and still convinced that his psychological research justified abducting and threatening innocent people. Jake made his way back to the tunnel system, but instead of following Chen's route, he accessed a different passage that would bring him out near the logging camp. Vale's twisted experiment was about to be terminated. Jake emerged from the mine tunnel system a quarter mile from the logging camp, exactly where his spatial memory had indicated. Vale would be monitoring the situation from his command post, coordinating his associates' response, analyzing the failure of his carefully constructed scenario. But Vale had made the same mistake that had doomed his military career. He'd underestimated the human variables in his psychological equations. Jake approached the logging camp using techniques he'd learned during his ranger training. Vale's surveillance network was focused on the mine complex now, tracking his associate's search for Chen and the unknown rescuer. Jake found Vale in the main building, surrounded by electronic monitoring equipment, speaking rapidly into a headset. The psychologist's calm demeanor had cracked, replaced by the frustrated urgency of a researcher watching his experiment collapse. "Dr. Vale," Jake said from the doorway. Vale spun around, his eyes wide with surprise and something that might have been admiration. "Remarkable. I had you positioned at the mine complex 15 minutes ago. Your surveillance network has gaps." Vale studied Jake's face, clearly fascinated despite the failure of his scenario. "How did you locate Dr. Chen so quickly? My associates reported no security breaches." "You were thinking like a psychologist, not a woodsman. This forest has been here for thousands of years. Your electronic toys are impressive, but they can't monitor what they can't see." Vale nodded slowly, as if Jake had confirmed a hypothesis. "Adaptive behavior exceeding environmental controls. Fascinating. You used indigenous knowledge to circumvent technological advantages. I used common sense to rescue an innocent person from a delusional predator." Vale's expression hardened slightly. "Predator? Mr. Morrison, I'm a researcher. My methods may be unconventional, but my objectives are scientifically valid. Your objectives are the rationalization of a damaged mind. You're not studying human psychology. You're acting out your own trauma." Vale was silent for a long moment, his eyes reflecting the internal struggle of someone confronting an uncomfortable truth. "Perhaps. But the data I've collected is still valuable. Your performance today has provided insights into adaptive problem-solving under extreme pressure." Jake stepped closer, noting that Vale made no move toward a weapon. The psychologist was still thinking like a researcher, even in defeat. "Dr. Chen is safe," Jake said. "Your associates are probably figuring out that their communications are being jammed by their own equipment. This is over." Vale smiled, the expression sad rather than threatening. "Yes, I believe it is. Though I must say, Mr. Morrison, you've been an exceptional subject. Your abilities exceed even your reputation. And you've been exactly what I expected, an intelligent person who convinced himself that his damage justified damaging others." Vale began removing electronic devices from his pockets, placing them carefully on the table. "May I ask how you knew about the tunnel system at the mine complex?" 7 years of ranger work. You learn every cave, every stream, every hidden passage, not because you're planning elaborate psychological experiments, but because knowing the terrain saves lives. And that knowledge allowed you to circumvent months of preparation. That knowledge is why I could help Dr. Chen, and you couldn't stop me." Vale finished disarming himself and sat down heavily in his chair. "I suppose I should congratulate you. Though I must admit I'm curious about your psychological profile. Most people would be traumatized by this experience. You seem almost energized." Jake considered the observation. Vale was right. The confrontation had activated something primal in Jake's psychology, a predator instinct that was satisfied by successful resolution of a threat. "Maybe that's the difference between us," Jake said. "I use those instincts to protect people. You use them to hurt people." Vale nodded slowly. "A fascinating distinction. I'll have to consider that in my future research." "You won't be conducting any more research." Jake heard the sound of approaching vehicles, probably Park Service units, responding to the emergency beacon Chen would have activated once she reached the main trail. Vale's experiment was truly over. "Mr. Morrison," Vale said, as the sound of sirens grew closer. "I want you to know that despite everything, I genuinely respect your abilities. You've taught me something important about the limitations of theoretical psychology." Jake looked at the man who had turned brilliant intelligence towards such destructive purposes. "What you should have learned is that real predators don't need to prove anything to anyone." The sirens were very close now. Vale would be arrested, charged, probably institutionalized. Chen would recover from her ordeal. The forest would return to its natural rhythms. But Jake knew that he'd been changed by the encounter. Vale's psychological assessment had been uncomfortably accurate. Jake was a predator, refined by training and pointed toward pro-social goals, but fundamentally comfortable with danger and conflict. As Park Service units surrounded the logging camp, Jake reflected on the lesson that would stay with him. The forest had taught him that survival wasn't about perfect preparation or theoretical understanding. It was about adaptation, instinct, and the willingness to act when action was required. Marcus Vale had learned that lesson too late to save himself, but perhaps not too late to understand what he'd become. Jake hoped that somewhere in the wreckage of the psychologist's brilliant mind, there was still enough humanity left to comprehend the true cost of his research. The forest kept its secrets, but it had given up this one. Jake Morrison walked toward the arriving emergency vehicles, carrying with him the knowledge that sometimes the most dangerous predators were the ones who convinced themselves they were something else entirely.